Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. In this special episode of the National Security Conversation, I have with me Ambassador Shyam Saran, the former Foreign Secretary of India. In his excellent new book entitled How China Sees India and the World, Ambassador Saran offers a sweeping survey of China over 3,000 years of its history and evolution. He undertakes the mighty task of making China and its ties with India better known to all of us. He takes us on a rich intellectual journey through the Chinese mind and culture, political institutions, and world visions. The book unpacks the central mores of Chinese political thinking and critical issues in India-China relations. Ambassador Saran, welcome to the National Security Conversations and congratulations on yet another fantastic book.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Ambassador Saran, your book is a terrific journey through the millennia of Chinese history, culture, and politics. What made a former diplomat write on what historians would normally write on?
Well, this is not a history book, I would like to make that very clear that, this is not a scholarly treatise on Chinese history. What I wanted to do was to present to a general reader, a certain kind of, familiarity with Chinese history, its very rich culture. What are the ways in which historically India and China have, interacted with one another, how these have shaped the perceptions of the two countries regarding one another. So it's really trying to, decode in a sense what many people in India and perhaps elsewhere also find, China a big mystery, an enigma, very difficult to understand. So this is really an effort in that direction. And as I said, it should not be regarded as a scholarly treatise in any way. It's more for a very general kind of reader.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. One of the things that we keep hearing about the Chinese, including from the Chinese, is China being the middle kingdom, as it were. How do we sort of unpack? I mean, having written what you have written, an voluminous book at that, how do we unpack the whole Chinese obsession with its centrality as the middle kingdom?
Yeah, so the centrality derives from a certain Chinese view of its own history. What I have pointed out is that China's view of the world has been, for example, very much influenced by the fact that while there was a settled agricultural population in the river valleys of China, there were, rich urban centers which had developed due to the, promotion of trade. China was always under constant assault by very aggressive and even violent tribes on its periphery. The steppe tribes essentially included the Mongols, for example, in history, also included the Manchus later on, both of which actually conquered the whole of China. So the constant perennial kind of challenge for China was how to deal with this constant threat on its borders. So there was a sense that here was a center of culture and civilization, or very advanced culture and civilization, with concentric circles of less and less, civilized and cultured, populations along its borders. And that is how that sense of, being a kind of a civilizational center or a middle kingdom complex came into being. So much of this then has become a legacy of the past for China. And also, don't forget, that China was a very large country and it was a very rich economy. Somewhat, self-sufficient in a sense because of its very size. And therefore, there was a kind of a sense that others need China, others want to trade with China, but we don't really need the rest of the world. So these are the reasons that lie behind that attitude.
Do the Chinese still have that complex about themselves? What contemporary implications does this Middle Kingdom complex have for China's behavior towards the rest of the world today?
Well, I mean, what it has done is, and as I pointed out, that China's concept of power is very hierarchical. I think that's an important, feature of the way China treats power. So it looks upon, the countries around it as somehow belonging to some kind of a pecking order, some kind of a ranking order, with China really at the top
Right.
as the most, dominant country. And it believes that this was really the case also in the past. You recall a conversation that, the former Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi, now he's, of course, state councillor, but during a meeting with the ASEAN countries, I think it was in 2010, where he reacted to some criticism about China moves in the South China Sea by saying, you are all very small countries and China is a big country, and that is just a fact. So this
Right.
reflects, in a sense, that sense of dominance, a sense that others should defer to us because we are a big power. So this is
Right.
something which you do see in the kind of arrogance of power, which is very evident in much of the behavior that we see of China. Almost a sense that we have always been the dominant power in Asia, and what is happening today is nothing but China going back to its natural position that it has always
Right.
enjoyed in history. This is really, the return of history in a sense.
Right. In that broader context and talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, you actually write in the book that this is something, BRI is something new and unprecedented. The road, BRI, is not a revival of some historical role of China as a great trading power. In fact, you argue that an imagined history is being put forward to seek legitimacy for China's claim to Asian hegemony. So this is an interesting argument that you're making. So in that context, Ambassador Saran, how can we understand, what can we understand about the Chinese grand strategy from the BRI perspective and the sort of careful narrative building around that BRI project? Given the fact that you're saying that this is really not, it is not really historically accurate.
So two things. If we, for example, look at the Silk Road, which is what China is harking back to. The Silk Road was actually a term which was coined by a German geographer. But, while he used the word silk, it is not as if, this particular road in history was only for the trading of Chinese silk. Number one, in addition to Chinese silk, there were a large number of other commodities which were, being exchanged back and forth over a network of roads, not just one road. There were a network of trading routes between
Right.
China, including India, including the ancient Persia, going by sea over to the Mediterranean, to the old Roman Empire. So there was a whole skein, in a sense, of trading routes. And China was really at one end of that network of routes. It was not the central point of that network.
Right.
For example, if you take even silk, Chinese silk would sometimes find its way to Indian ports through the Central Asian, trading routes, and then from the Indian ports, like Barigaza or Broch, as it is known, would be then transported to the Roman Empire. There were also Indian goods which were being exchanged. As you are aware, that Indian cotton textiles were greatly valued, not just in the Mediterranean, but also in the whole of Southeast Asia. There were spices which were being exchanged. Both spices which were grown in India, but also spices which came to Indian ports from Southeast Asia. So it is a much more complex history of trade, in which China was a participant, but China was not the nodal point or not the central point, as it were. Even if you take the maritime trade, it is true that a considerable amount of trade, for example, would take place between the Chinese ports on the Chinese eastern coast and ports in Southeast Asia, ports in India, the Malabar coast, for example, or the Coromandel coast. There was a lot of trade taking place along these maritime routes. But it was not as if China was the central point of those routes. In a sense, you can say that, India was much more of a crossroads for both land routes as well as maritime routes. And that is what gave India its very cosmopolitan kind of culture, because it was lying astride both maritime routes as well as the Central Asian caravan routes. So this is one aspect, that the history itself is far more complicated, and the history does not testify to a centrality to China as it is being argued today. Secondly, as I have said, the Belt and Road Initiative is a very ambitious exercise. It is not only creating new highways, railroads, digital highways across Eurasia. It is also building up ports, for example, in South Asia, in the Gulf, Africa as well. So this is something which is really a new phase in Chinese history. China has not been as sort of externally engaged in the past as it is being engaged today. So yes, there is an effort on the part of China to suggest that this central role that China is seeking as far as the global economy is concerned is also somehow going back to the past, where China enjoyed that same kind of centrality. That aspect is what I question.
Right. Ambassador Saran, you said the BRI project is a very ambitious project, clearly so. But in retrospect, do you think India probably should have looked at the BRI project, in a more conciliatory manner? We shouldn't have said completely no to it. Or do you think we did the right thing by saying no to the BRI project, no, right from the start?
So let me answer that by pointing out two important aspects. See, India did not, for example, have much reservation of being part and parcel of another Chinese, promoted project, save the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, or you take the BRICS Development Bank. These are two very important multilateral, initiatives, and fair to say that these were promoted by China. But why did India not have a problem with those institutions? Because they were truly multilateral institutions, in the design of which, in the working out the kind of procedures through which, say, lending would take place from those banks. What would be the performance criteria which would be followed? What would be the personnel criteria which would be followed? India was a very important participant in those consultations, which finally led to the setting up of these institutions. And as you know, India is the second largest shareholder in both the banks, and Indian is a vice president of AIIB. It has been a president of the BRICS Development Bank. So it is not that we have had any kind of a problem with a Chinese initiated project, as long as it gave us also an opportunity to participate as a partner. If you take the Belt and Road Initiative, what is the reason why we have had a reservation? Because unlike, say, AIIB, this particular project is a Chinese design project. It is a Chinese initiative project. Nobody has asked us, do we agree with the manner in which this particular project is being set up? We have not had any kind of input in terms of how this is going to be designed. So this is a Chinese-led, Chinese-initiated, Chinese-designed project. And essentially what we are being asked is you just sign on to it. And if we ask how will this operate, then say this is something to be worked out later, which I don't think
Right.
is a very good way of trying to promote this kind of a project. So it is not multilateral. It is a Chinese
Right.
project, and it is a network of essentially bilateral kind of cooperation agreements between China and various partner countries. It is not as if it is a multilateralized kind of initiative. So this is, I think, the reservation that we had, and I think that reservation was well.
Right.
Secondly, if you look at the actual record
Right.
of the BRI, in terms of the patterns of financing which have evaluation which has been followed, some problems are arising now, isn't it? I mean, if you take, say, the case of Sri Lanka, or even the Maldives, there are difficulties because of the fact that it has not done the kind of due diligence which should have been done before initiating this project. Even Pakistan, you can find that problems are arising. So on balance, I would say that the caution which India has displayed in terms of its participation in the BRI, I think that is fairly well founded. And of course, if there are projects which China undertakes, for example, in Central Asia, or it undertakes in other parts of the world, which are infrastructure projects, I presume that these are not only exclusively for Chinese use. I presume that if there is a mutual interest, yes, India and China can work together on that.
Right. Ambassador Saran, in fact, you spoke about, earlier on, you spoke about India being at the center of trade and civilization rather than China being at the center of it. But, how did China's perception of India go from an independent center of civilization, spirituality, and knowledge to that of a slave nation under the British and a launch pad for the latter's depredations against China? What do you mean when you say that India served as a teacher by negative example to China?
Yeah, so India was a teacher by positive example in the earlier period, because despite that sense of centrality that ancient China may have had, there is no doubt that the encounters with India, during the first millennium, those encounters actually created in China an image of an alternate center of culture and civilization. And
Right.
perhaps a center of culture and civilization even more advanced than China. So the spread of Buddhism, for example, to China, the fact that several Indian teachers and scholars came to China in order to translate Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. You are aware that several Chinese monks made the long journey to India, very dangerous, through very dangerous terrain, again to study at advanced centers of learning like Nalanda University or the Vikramshila University. They studied under Indian masters and had a very, very positive view, almost reverential view of what ancient India was. And so India did not quite fit into the middle kingdom kind of a complex at that point of time.
Right.
Here was some distance away, but here was an alternate center of culture and civilization. Now, this continued to be the case till the end of the first millennium. These kind of contacts continued between India and China. Also, trade was taking place between India and China during this time as well. But as soon as you start entering the second millennium, after 1000 AD, for example, then two things have happened. One is that in India itself, Buddhism becomes a much weaker kind of a religion, It's already in decay, even when the Chinese monks are visiting India. And by 1000 AD, it has virtually disappeared from India, even though it has flourished in many other parts of Asia. Secondly, this was also the time when the Muslim invasions began in India. And this also acted to interrupt many of the established, sort of routes of trade and contact between China and India, and not just between India and China, but India and many other countries. So you have a period after 1000 AD where India essentially drops off the radar screen, as it were, as in Chinese eyes. And when does India then resurface in Chinese consciousness? It resurfaces precisely at a time when India is under British colonial rule. And that encounter, after this long gap of history, that encounter is a very unpleasant encounter. Why? Because the colonial power, Britain, in its depredations against China, say, for example, the Opium Wars, who were the foot soldiers of the British imperialists or the colonists? It was the Indians.
Right.
Or take the concessions, for example, in Shanghai, who were the police forces? Well, they were Indians. A lot of, Sikh policemen were serving in the British concession.
Right.
Also, the opium trade itself also enriched a lot of Indians, not just the British. So one of the things that came up while I was researching for the book was how much Mumbai's prosperity was built originally on profits derived from the opium trade, because there were some very rich, Parsi traders, Marwari traders, who also made a lot of money from the opium trade.
Right.
So there was this kind of a negative sense about India that, it has, from being such an alternate center of culture and civilization, it has now fallen to the role of a slave nation.
Right.
And that, it is like an instrument of oppression being used by the British imperialists against China. So this is the origin of that, that phrase which I have used of India being a teacher by negative example, that this is not what China should become.
Right.
This is the message which comes from the period where the Qing Empire is coming to an end, and you see the stirrings of nationalism, you see the stirrings of Chinese resurgence taking place, and in that period, therefore, who are the models? Even though China has been defeated by Japan, but Japan is more of a model because it has shown how it can, resist Western imperialism, how it has managed to use the knowledge and technology of the West to become a great power itself, not India. No.
Right.
So, yes, it is true that, for some time, the independence struggle which was taking place in India, also against the British, and you had the revolutionary struggle taking place in China, that was also against Western imperialism. There was a certain sense of mutual sympathy and mutual support, but were rather superficial, as it turned out.
Right. Ambassador Saran, in fact, sticking to the Southeast Asian region, you actually write in the book that it is misleading to claim that the entire East and Southeast Asian region is somehow a part of a Chinese Confucian value, and that, by contrast, Indian cultural influence spread over a much larger area, shaped political thought and institutions, religious beliefs, language and literature, and art and culture in general. This is interesting because China seems to make a completely different argument. In fact, some scholars also seem to make this argument about China's cultural influence in Southeast Asia. You seem to be making exactly the opposite argument, an interesting one.
So it is not that China did not have influence in the region. That would not be correct to say. But what I have said is that, yes, there was some kind of a Cyanosphere which came up, where the use of Chinese language or where the use of Chinese aesthetics was quite, dominant. So you had Japan, for example. Japan language was very much influenced by China, or Japanese Buddhism, Zen, for example, again very much influenced by the whole concept of Chan, which originally came from the Indian Dhyan. This also influenced Japan. You can say the same thing about Korea, very much influenced by China. You could say the same about Vietnam, because Vietnam was under Chinese occupation for several centuries and therefore was very much impacted by Chinese culture. But if you go beyond this so-called Sinosphere, you do not see much impact of Chinese culture in the rest of Southeast Asia. So there is much more influence by India, because first you have Sanskrit, you have the Hindu religion, later on you have the Buddhist religion spread all over this region. Also, a long period of very flourishing trade between India and Southeast Asian countries, particularly, as I mentioned to you, the spice trade, the popularity of Indian textiles throughout Southeast Asia. And, you just have to see the echoes and colors of India today in virtually every Southeast Asian country. So I'm not claiming something which is not there. I have served in Indonesia, for example. I have served in Myanmar. And I can testify to the fact that there is a lot of the imprint of India in these countries. I'm not saying that they borrowed everything from India, but I can certainly say that the cultural spark which was provided by India led to an efflorescence of culture in these countries. They had their own genius, they had their own aesthetics, but you can see that there was a certain inspiration which came from India. So in that sense, I think it is not incorrect to say that while Chinese influence, cultural influence and values was perhaps certainly transmitted to countries like Japan or to Korea or to Vietnam, those values do not necessarily find an echo in much of the rest of Asia.
Right. Ambassador Saran, you also mentioned the issue of Tibet in the book. You write that neither the Mongols nor the Manchus considered Tibet as part of China, yet the contemporary Chinese narrative obfuscates this to claim that Tibet has always been part of China since ancient times. You also write that the Chinese have wanted the Dalai Lama to acknowledge this as a condition for resuming talks. So in this context, how do you sort of understand Tibet, its relation to China, and its significance for the India-China sort of boundary conflict, or the larger conflict, as it were?
Yeah, so one is the history part, and the other is what the contemporary situation is. So the history part is that the argument that Tibet has always been a part of China, that is contestable. This is what I have said. Yes, for example, the Mongols ruled over what may be called a multi-ethnic empire. So you not only had the Huns as part of the empire, but there were also the Mongols who were part of the empire. There were several tribes, for example, on the periphery, which were also part of the empire. Tibet also was a part of that empire. So it was not as if the Mongols were ruling over a Chinese empire which included all this. No. The Mongols ruled over an empire which included both Hans as well as other ethnic groups. So that's an important distinction to make. Right. Exactly the same thing happened also under the Manchus. Manchus also had a multi-ethnic empire. It was not a Han empire. Now, when China was, for example, towards the end of the of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when the struggle against the Manchus began, the Manchus were actually attacked as being an alien, ruler of China. So a lot of the reform movement which was taking place was directed not against the West so much; it was directed against the Manchus because they were seen as an oppressive alien regime. Now, what has happened subsequently is that since during the Manchu time, the empire, the Manchu Empire, was actually the maximum that had been achieved in history by any empire ruling over China. China basically just inherited that the most expansive phase of history and said this is what China is. You know, the
Right. Right.
Manchus as an alien rule was forgotten. So there is almost like a continuous history of China from the ancient time to the present, and these are all Chinese empires.
Right.
The
Right.
fact that 50% of its history, China was also ruled by alien races, has been completely brushed over. So
Interesting.
India is criticized that it is a slave country because it has, for such a long period of its history, it has been under alien rule. But that is true of China, China as well. So there
Right.
is a kind of a reinterpretation of history. So what began as actually a very strong Han, reaction against alien rule, that alien rule has now become sanitized in a sense. It has been made part and parcel of this, single stream of history in China. So this
Right.
is
Right.
something which I think we should question. Of course, all countries tell stories about themselves. So it is not,
So do we.
something specific to China. But I think it is important for us, if we wish to understand China and we wish to understand what lie behind the kind of perceptions that China has of India, which is the prism through which it is looking at the rest of the world. I think a familiarity with this history is very important.
Right. Ambassador, I mean, there was an additional question that I wanted your inputs on. How does, for example, Tibet play a role in the India-China sort of standoff
Yeah.
in modern times?
Yeah. So, as I said, I mean, what I wanted to do was to contest the history that Tibet has always been a part of China. It has not always been a part of China. I mean, that is very clear from history. And when they go back to the Tang dynasty and say there was a kind of a willing kind of acceptance of the Tang, being the elder brother, and the Tibetan king being the younger brother. That simply does not accord with history. In fact, the Tibetan forces even sacked the then Tang capital of Chang'an and imposed peace on the Tang emperor, and were receiving tribute from the Tang emperor for quite some time as a result of their defeat. So you cannot claim that is actually shows that Tibet was always a part of China. It was not. It had defeated China at that particular point of time.
Right.
And later on, as I mentioned to you, whether it is the Mongols or the Manchus, yes, Tibet was certainly a part of their larger empire, but it was not part of a Chinese empire. China too was part of that
Right.
multi-ethnic empire, but it was not as if it was a Chinese empire controlling Tibet or any other territory. Now, when China occupied Tibet in 1950, two things happened. One was that China and India for the first time had actually a boundary between them, because so far there was no boundary between India and China except for in the western part, the what is today's Xinjiang and Kashmir, but that was a
Yeah.
shorter. But here, this was a very vast area where we had not confronted China in the past. I mean, there was hardly any confrontation between India and China in the past. So for the first time in history, we actually became neighbors of China. Secondly,
Right.
because of the fact that Tibet had not, in fact, been a part of China for most of its history, it was no surprise that there was a considerable resistance in Tibet to an attempt by China to try and incorporate this into the territory of China. This was what led to the revolt in 1959. Now, India, on the other side, even if it had no ambitions with regard to Tibet or did not want to contest Chinese control over Tibet, from the Chinese perspective, India was seen as a spoil. And whatever may be happening on the border then began to be seen as a Indian attempt to try and contest Chinese control over Tibet, because India itself had designs on Tibet. So before
Right.
1959, there were skirmishes taking place at the border, but those skirmishes were not very serious. They did not really impact on the overall fairly positive relationship between the two countries. This changed in 1959. Why did it change? Because there was a revolt in Tibet, which made the Chinese very, very nervous and anxious. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual and temporal head, came and sought shelter in India, and India did extend that shelter to him. And that, from the Chinese perspective, was evidence that India was trying to somehow subvert Chinese control over Tibet. This was certainly not the
Right.
intention on the Indian side, and India was not even capable of doing that. But I think we should put ourselves in their shoes and see how they were looking at the situation.
Right.
So the skirmishes which were taking place earlier at the
Exactly.
border, after 1959, started being looked as from a kind of as a kind of a strategic threat. That these clashes taking place at the border were on the Indian side designed to subvert Chinese control over Tibet. And that particular element of discord between the two countries has persisted ever since. Which is why I have also argued frequently that any settlement of the border issue between India and China will have to involve some understanding between the two countries on the issue of Tibet.
Right. Ambassador, I know we have spent a lot of time. Here is my last question to you, and that is really about the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What implications do you think it will have for global geopolitics, and what are some of the lessons that China is drawing from this conflict? Because this is not just a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This is also a conflict between Russia and the United States and the West. So what implications, what lessons do you think China is drawing from this?
Sure. So firstly, I would say that there is a certain kind of revision which has to be made in both Chinese as well as Russian perceptions with regard to the so-called terminal decline of the US and the West. The sense that US is, even if it is still powerful, it doesn't have the will to fight anymore. As far as Western Europe is concerned, it is fragmented. It has no ability to actually emerge as a kind of a cohesive force. What Ukraine war has done is to really question some of those assumptions. Particularly, I think in China, after the global financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008, here is the world's most powerful economy, which is beset with economic crisis. It is becoming weaker. You have the same thing happening with Western Europe as well. So they are economically enfeebled precisely at a time when China is growing from strength to strength. That is the perception. So when Xi Jinping has talked about we are in the midst of changes unseen in a century. Okay, that is one part of the phrase. The second part of the phrase is unseen for a century, and it is irreversible. The balance of power has changed in a manner that is irreversible, meaning thereby that the West is in terminal decline. This is a judgment shared by China and Russia. And I think
That's right.
if you see that very clearly emerging in the December 4, 2021, joint declaration between China and Russia at Beijing during the Winter Olympics. That really this is our moment. It is now possible for us to be able to write the rules of the game of a new international order. So in that sense, the miscalculation which Russia made with respect to Ukraine, that this will be over within a few days, we will be able to force the West to recognize that Russia is a key stakeholder as far as European security is concerned. That you cannot have a security architecture in Europe in which Russia does not have a decisive voice. And this is supported by China, because China is saying that as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, there cannot be similarly an architecture where China does not have a decisive voice. So the Xi Jinping's concept of a new kind of common security that he is talking about. So what has happened as a result of the Ukraine war, not going the manner in which was anticipated by Russia and even by China? The fact that quite dramatically Russia has been, in a sense, unplugged from the global economy, by being taken off the SWIFT payment system, the very sweeping sanctions which have been put on it. This has come as a bit of a shock to both Russia, but also to China, that the assumptions that they had made about the terminal decline of the US, of fragmentation in amongst the Europeans, this somehow seems to have been reversed as a result of the Ukraine war. So I'm sure that there must be a lot of recalculation taking place. So on balance, if you ask me, how has it impacted so far? I would say it has put China somewhat on the defensive. From a phase where it was basically pushing and being very aggressive everywhere, it has, in a sense, given it a bit of a setback. And the latest demonstration of that is what has happened with Wang Yi's visit recently to the Pacific countries, where he wanted that the Pacific countries should sign on to a Chinese, a kind of a blueprint for the region, for collective security as well, not just trade or economics. This is about security. And I think Wang Yi was even angry, I think, that what seemed to have been agreed from beforehand actually did not come about. So I think you are seeing a certain pushback to China. Of course, Russia is in a rather difficult situation, but I think also my sense is that China is also somewhat on the defensive. And that, from the Indian point of view, is of course good news.
Ambassador Saran, great insights, wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining the show. And may I also thank our viewers for watching the show. Thank you everyone so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best.